Hi everyone, William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri video series. We're in 1939 today. I am having some phone issues, so if you're watching this, it is truly a minor miracle. Fingers crossed that you are. And what else? I wanted to thank the two people who commented. For me to get two comments over the course of, I think, the last 3 days is also a minor miracle, and it's always very welcome. So thank you for that. Now, what do we have today? Well, let's do our recap. So in the previous... No, this isn't what I'm looking for. That is 1915. Here we go. Our recap. So in 1915, Dmitri had a visit with Barasova and Barasova's sister, and he was actually more interested in another person who was there, a man who was supposedly a psychic and a clairvoyant. And then he went off and met the theater critic Plisheyev, quite a bit older than him, and they kind of went on the prowl a little bit and picked up a couple of women, and we'll hear more about that later. Okay, 1939, we had Dmitri sort of defining Ukraine in really downplaying its importance, and whether he really felt that, the Ukrainians were just kind of lesser than the great Russians. I don't know. I don't know. He calls it a province, and says that the language is a dialect, but as one of the commenters pointed out, this was very typical for Russians at that time, and for a lot of Ukrainians to just consider themselves part of Russia, part of the whole. But there was always a Ukrainian independence movement. One of the reasons, so Dmitri pointed out that Ukraine, sorry, I mangled that, is, the name means on the frontier, or the frontier, what was the other word he used? Anyway, and it was where, if I recall correctly, it was where the Cossacks went because they wanted to get away from the centralized government. They wanted to get a little bit away from that, and so that's why you had so many Cossack settlements in Ukraine, I believe. Okay, our cast today, we have, of all people, kind of out of left field, Cesare Borgia, obviously not making a personal appearance. We have Stalin, not surprising, and we have a very, very interesting figure, General Tukhachevsky, and we're going to find out what Dmitri thinks of him, which is quite interesting. All right, so we start with Fayard. This is did I say we're in 1939? We're actually on December 28th, 1938. I always get that mixed up. This is the Candide Interview. We're nearing the end of it. I may have said last time that this would be the last section of it, but no, there will be definitely one section left, and then the conclusion, there will definitely be that plus the conclusion, or else I'll do the penultimate section and then the conclusion. All right, here we go. Fayard begins by saying, I believe that certain realists, like Cesare Borgia, would claim that all means are good when it comes to taking a chance. Dmitri replies, yes, I know, but I can't share their opinion. I can't even imagine that they are, in fact, the true realists. Then we go to Fayard. May I ask you a question, Monseigneur? Could you not have believed 2 or 3 years ago that Stalin himself was abandoning communism and turning to other ideas? Oh, no, this is Dmitri. I didn't give Stalin the slightest credit, believe me. But it is certain that at that time, With Stalin or in spite of him, a Russian patriotic movement began to emerge. And I'm not talking about clan loyalty, but a true patriotism linked to tradition. It's a real phenomenon in the army, thanks to generals like Tukhachevsky and among the peasants and in a kind of new bourgeoisie created by the technician class. Films like the one made in praise of Peter the Great were quite typical of that state of mind. But you know how Stalin reacted. The Georgian is a Bolshevik, a real one, believe me. But his star is fading. One can't govern by massacre forever. Now, this, I believe, is Fayard. It's not 100% clear the way the quotation marks are used in this, but I believe it's Fayard saying, but his star is fading. One can't govern by massacre forever. Now, definitely Dmitri. I'm convinced of that. That's why we must not lend him prestige by making him the defender of Russia. Okay, we're going to stop there. Pretty short section, but lots to talk about. In fact, I'm just going to make a quick note here about the Georgian and the use of the term Bolshevik. All right, so let's start with Cesare Borgia, who's brought up not by Dmitri but Fayard. So I think primarily what Fayard is referring to is probably the famous Machiavelli book, The Prince, and Borgia was one of the figures that was a sort of model for that Machiavelli drew on for The Prince, and this whole idea of the end justifies the means, and yeah, so Fayard is kind of tying that in with the idea of, well, if you're going to gamble, you're going to take a chance, then you need to use all possible means. And what exactly does he mean by that? I guess he means, well, you know, maybe Russian emigres should partner with the Germans, or not partner with the Germans, but support the Germans and be actively involved in an invasion of Ukraine. I guess, I mean, that's stupid. Dmitri very clearly pointed out that it would not do to have Russians going in and shedding the blood of their countrymen. So, yeah. And he immediately refutes this idea and says, well, you call them the realists, you know, the pragmatic type, but I don't share their opinion that the ends justifies the means, and I can't even imagine that they really are realists, and I think he's right about that. So good for you, old boy. Let's see. Now, this is is Fayard trying to be provocative? I would like to know, because he says, yeah, may I ask you a question, Monsignor? So when he says, could you not have believed 2 or 3 years ago that Stalin was abandoning communism? Well, it was precisely during that period, 2, 3, 4 years ago, actually, that Dmitri was traveling around France and giving speeches that sounded suspiciously like they were supportive of Stalin, or at least not Stalin himself. If not Stalin himself, then at least the things that he was doing, like building the world's largest airplane, which of course immediately crashed, that his accomplishments were worthy of praise. And so maybe Fayard is provoking Dmitri a little bit and alluding to that. You know, you got this reputation, Monsignor, as being sort of a fellow traveler. And that was true. And Kazembek, the head of the Russian party, on behalf of whom Dmitri was giving these speeches, was definitely a fellow traveler. Okay, so I gather that Fayard has done his homework and knows a little bit about Dmitri, and Dmitri is, of course, immediately going to do his best to refute this and say, oh, no, no, I didn't do that. And Fayard even includes the exclamation points in Dmitri's response. So now, he's saying, well, no, I always saw through Stalin, but I also know that despite Stalin, or even without his example, people were there. There was this patriotic movement going on in Russia at that time. Well, how did he know that? He had this little information bureau back in 1921 that he formed specifically to gather intelligence. But I'm not saying he'd revived it. I'm sure there were. Well, the Peter the Great movie is one example of how there is. Well, but Stalin had that made. But anyway, this idea of patriotism surging in Russia around the same time, 35, 36, 37, when Dmitri was at his most active with young Russia. And yeah, so what was it, though, that made Fayard think that Stalin was turning from communism? Well, it was no longer all this, he turned on Trotsky. It was no longer the international, the world communism. And, Stalin was starting to get a little nervous about the threats from outside. So it was in his interest to stir up a little nationalism, at least. But Dmitri may also be right that even without that inclination on Stalin's part, there was this sort of resurgence in Russian patriotism in the Soviet Union. And, he talks about this new technician class. He talks about the peasants. But the person who he talks about, who really turns out to be greatly interesting, because I didn't know who this man was. And the first time I read this interview, I didn't look him up, but he turns out to be such a fascinating person, General Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky. So he was called the Red Napoleon, and Dmitri is saying that patriotism in the army is a real phenomenon, or at least was a real phenomenon, thanks to generals like Tukhachevsky. Okay, and I can tell you, this is precisely the sort of man that Dmitri admired and in a certain way wanted to be. Dmitri always saved his greatest admiration for what he called men of action, and for a short time in 1917, he even put Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, in that category and praised Kerensky. This is a true man of action, he said. Well, it's not surprising then that he really admires Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky, because the Red Napoleon was the sort of epitome of a man of action, truly, whether you agree with what he did or not. He was around Dmitri's age, either a couple years older or a couple years younger. He started out as a guards officer from a family of hereditary nobility, and he was in the Semyonovsky Guards Regiment. He was all along a militant atheist, so that kind of answers the question as to why he went from being a guards officer to being on board with communism. Well, he was just extra militant atheist. Apparently, he said, I don't like Jews and I don't like Christians, and the reason I don't like Jews is because they brought Christianity in the world. Not that they necessarily wanted to, but yeah. So he was also a neo-pagan. He wanted to bring back the worship of Perun, who was a sort of pre-Christian Russian god, kind of like Odin, I think. And he had to recant that later on, because it wasn't convenient for a Soviet general to, I guess, to be a neo-pagan. It was a kind of religion, I guess. But he had, during the First World War, he'd been captured, and he was put in a prisoner of war, a German prisoner of war camp, and he actually escaped 4 times. And the 5th time he succeeded. And I think the 5th time was after the revolution, and he made a beeline back to Russia. Despite being a nobleman and a guards officer, he was very enthusiastic about the revolution. And he fought with the Red Army during the Civil War, and he proved to be a really brilliant military commander. He helped to defend Moscow and to retake Siberia from Kolchak. So Dmitri's admiration is interesting, because this was the man who really, really brought about one of the people who was really responsible for the victory of the Reds over the Whites and the Tsarist troop. He commanded the Western Front in the Soviet-Polish War from 1920 to 1921, and I remember Dmitri following that very avidly in 1920 and feeling really sort of torn apart, because he didn't want the Poles to succeed in taking territory in Ukraine, but he also didn't want, the Bolsheviks to succeed. So he didn't quite know what to do at that point, who to root for, as it was. And then Tukhachevsky became the actual chief of staff of the entire Red Army. That was between 1925 and 1928. And then finally, at the age of 42, he became a marshal of the Soviet Union, of whom there were only ever, a small number. So I'm going to quote just a little bit from the Wikipedia article about him. As a major proponent of modernization of Soviet armament and army force structure in the 1920s and 1930s, he became instrumental in the development of Soviet aviation and of mechanized and airborne forces. As a theoretician, he was a driving force behind the Soviet development of the theory of deep operations in the 1920s and 1930s. So again, this is precisely the sort of thing that Dmitri was praising when he was giving his Young Russia speeches, these kind of, genuine advancements. Dmitri was all for modernization, and he looked upon these things as something that Russians should be proud of. But then along came the military purges of 1936, 1938. So if I recall correctly, Tukhachevsky became a marshal of the Soviet Union in 1936, and he was allowed to go on this sort of European tour. He was in France and Germany, and I can't remember where else. So the same time that Dmitri was traveling around France giving these speeches, Tukhachevsky was making his tour. And needless to say, they didn't meet. But I'm sure Dmitri was aware of him already at this time and already admiring him. But it didn't last long, this period of triumph for Tukhachevsky, because by 1937 he was on the list, and he was arrested, he was tortured, so much so that in fact the confession that he signed is splattered with his blood. It's a document that still exists. He recanted everything, and the accusation was treason. And one almost wonders if he was allowed to go on this European tour so that later on they could accuse him of treason, and I think specifically that he was a German agent. Then there's this line that I think is Fayard, saying government by massacre is not going to be a good long-term strategy. And I guess he's... I don't know, was he referring to the starvation of the Ukraine or specifically to the purges? I don't know. I mean, it's a good thing that this interview was given in France, because the British would have been very, very upset by this. Dmitri had been in London in 1938, and this is precisely the sort of thing that Grunwald was talking about, that the British did not want Russian emigres to do, which is to criticize Stalin. But of course, it's Fayard, not Dmitri, who's talking about government by massacre. And yeah, of course, Dmitri goes along with that. Yeah, that's not a good strategy, is it? That's only going to last so long that you can intimidate people and make that work. Then he refers to the Peter the Great movie, and Dmitri is citing this as proof of the upsurge of patriotism in the Soviet Union. It came out in 1937, certainly with Stalin's blessing, if not with his initiative. It may have been because he wanted, feeling like the country was threatened, he wanted to rouse people's patriotism, and Dmitri will refer to it later in either the September or the October 1939 letter to Maria, and this time he's going to be not so gung-ho about it. And Maria is the one who's gung-ho and saying, you know, and there's, if I remember rightly, I need to relook at this, and Dmitri is the one saying, well, you know, forget this movie. It's just not happening, sis. This turn away from the communism, the Marxist-Leninism. Now, the reference to how Stalin reacted, even though it comes after this statement about the Peter the Great movie, is, I believe, a reference to the purges. You saw how Stalin reacted to, I think he's talking about, to this sort of bottom-up, spontaneous patriotism in the country that Stalin reacted to that, and to people like Tukhachevsky, whom for some reason Dmitri considers a true patriot, you know, one that would be a whole topic for discussion, and Stalin reacts by purging these people. Okay. Phew. So, what do we have next time? Well, 1915, we'll have Maria arrive in Moscow. We'll have Dmitri feeling very irritable, both at Sis and at primarily the fact that he has to go back to Usovo. Okay, and in 1939, Dmitri is, all of this has clearly turned his head a little bit. You know, this was the moment he was waiting for, and we have him talking about how thousands of emigres are turning to him for advice. And we also have the subject of young Vladimir being in Berlin. So that's something Fayard wants to talk about. So, yeah, come back. All good stuff. Take care. Bye.